While history is often thought of as a series of events, often, even usually, these events are preceded by negotiations and debate, both between and within different groups. This is certainly the case with events surrounding the indigenous American tribes, a history filled with negotiations, treaties, and debates. And this history raises important questions about debate and diplomacy. If diplomacy is characterized as a game of chess, what happens when the rules are changed in the middle of the game? What happens when one side has all the power? And if debate is the exchange and discussion of different perspectives, what happens when one side of the debate is consistently ignored and not listened to? Nowhere has this dynamic been more apparent than in the relationship between the U.S. government and the Cherokee Nation, and in particular in the events surrounding the Indian Removal Act and the Cherokee Nation's forced removal from their ancestral lands. To understand the debate and diplomacy surrounding the Indian Removal Act, understanding some Cherokee history and their relationship with the U.S. government is useful context. The first treaty signed between the United States government and the Cherokee Nation was the 1785 Treaty of Hopewell. In it, the boundary of America was established with the Cherokee allotted lands to the west. The treaty established peace between the two nations, stating that the hatchet shall forever be buried. The treaty also guaranteed the land of the Cherokee and allowed them to send a delegate to the American Congress. But while the treaty spoke of Cherokee sovereignty, the facts on the ground told a different story. At the time of signing in 1785, over 3,000 American settlers were already living in Cherokee territory, and despite what the treaty said, the settlers' numbers would only grow. Between 1785 and 1820, the Cherokee would end up signing 15 more treaties ceding land to the federal or state governments. This would happen even though several treaties promised that Cherokee land would be protected forever. Despite encroachment from the new nation of America, or perhaps because of it, the Cherokee endeavored to create a nation-state that combined the unique Cherokee culture with the organization of an 18th century nation. In doing so, they became known as one of the civilized tribes, and followed a path of acculturation proposed by many of the founding fathers, including George Washington. In 1821, the Cherokee developed a written language. In 1827, the Cherokee adopted a written constitution, and in 1828, the Cherokee Phoenix was published, the first Native American newspaper. While many Cherokee welcomed the growing organization and prosperity of their nation, outside of the Cherokee Nation, the state governments, and in particular, Georgia, saw an increasing threat to their growth and control over the Cherokee. The stage was set for what would become the seminal struggle of the Cherokee's existence, the Indian removal debate. By the 1820s, U.S. policy towards Native tribes had evolved from the original policies of acculturation to policies of removal. The idea of relocating the Native tribes westward was not new, dating back to Thomas Jefferson's presidency. Removal advocates argued that relocating the tribes was the best way to prevent conflict and save the Native populations. Senator John Elliott of Georgia said regarding the Native tribes, "Like a promontory of sand exposed to the ceaseless encroachments of the ocean, they have been gradually wasting away before the current of white population." By 1825, the idea of removal had gained enough support that President James Monroe made a presentation to Congress in support of Indian removal. On the other side of the debate, the Cherokee vigorously disagreed with the removalists. From an editorial in the Cherokee Phoenix newspaper, "We repeat again that the Cherokees are not on the decline in numbers and improvement, and we hope we shall for this once be believed, and that the advocates of Indian emigration will urge the necessity of our removal upon some other reason than that of our degraded condition." And in their opposition to removal, the Cherokee were joined by non-Native Americans. Periodical editor Jeremiah Everts wrote articles in favor of Indian rights and encouraged readers to petition their elected representatives. Soon Congress was flooded with petitions arguing against the injustices of removal. but the political and economic forces at play were too powerful. In 1829, gold was discovered within Cherokee territory, and southern plantation owners eyed the Cherokee land for cotton production. President Andrew Jackson, a veteran of prior Indian wars, pursued the idea of removal as his signature presidential achievement, and in 1830, the Indian Removal Act narrowly passed both houses of Congress and was signed into law. The passage of the Indian Removal Act authorized the federal government to negotiate with native tribes on the conditions of their relocation westward. Most of the Cherokee didn't want to relocate and agreed with the opinion of their newspaper. To compel relocation, either by direct coercion or by the intrigues, is a measure against which we would protest with all our energies. But some Cherokees felt otherwise. As early as 1816, a group of Cherokees, known as the Old Settlers, relocated to Arkansas, Missouri, and as far away as Spanish Texas. Within the Cherokee that remained, a group began advocating for a negotiated resettlement. Known as the Treaty Party, these Cherokee were convinced that the best approach for the Cherokee was to negotiate the terms of what they saw as an inevitable resettlement. While prominent, the Treaty Party was not representative of the Cherokee population and their elected leadership, who all opposed relocation and were led by Principal Chief John Ross. Because of these internal disagreements, negotiations between the Cherokee and U.S. government consumed many months, and by the end of 1835 had not yet reached a conclusion. Unable to build consensus and unwilling to abandon the idea of removal, the U.S. government waited until Principal Chief John Ross was out of town. U.S. negotiator John Schemerhorn then met with a small group of Treaty Party members, and on December 30th, 1835, signed the new Treaty of Echota with this small group. The Treaty of New Echota traded Cherokee land for cash and new territory west of the Mississippi. The elected Cherokee government appealed to Congress. The treaty had been signed by a small group of usurpers and not by the elected Cherokee government. In addition to presenting to Congress a petition of over 15,000 signatures, Ross also enlisted the support of prominent citizens, such as Ralph Waldo Emerson, to plead the Cherokee case. It now appears that the government of the United States choose to hold the Cherokees to this sham treaty and are proceeding to execute the same. The American president and the cabinet, the Senate and the House of Representatives, neither hear these men nor see them. The Cherokee protests were to no avail. The Treaty of New Echota was ratified by the Senate, and removal occurred between 1836 and 1838, at first voluntarily, and then by force. This forced westward migration of over 2,000 miles to their new territory claimed the lives of thousands of Cherokees and became known as the Trail of Tears. Cherokee history does not end with the Trail of Tears. Following their relocation, the U.S. Civil War divided and punished the tribe, while the Dawes Act of 1887 split what was once communal land into individual household allotments. At the turn of the century, preparation for Oklahoma statehood eliminated most Cherokee institutions, which along with full civil rights were only restored in the latter half of the 20th century. Yet the Cherokee have persevered. Today, the Cherokee Nation numbers over 300,000 citizens and is the largest federally recognized Native American tribe. Throughout their history, the Cherokee have shown persistence in the face of one-sided negotiations and unkept diplomatic promises. And though their voices were often ignored, the Cherokee would not be silenced in arguing for justice. This persistence and commitment may be finally bearing fruit, as modern court rulings have yielded greater recognition of Cherokee sovereignty, most recently with the U.S. Supreme Court's McGirt decision of 2020. And more than 250 years after the original Treaty of Hopewell, a Cherokee delegate has been appointed to the American Congress. While none of this compensates for the injustices of the past, it does perhaps show that even in an unfair game of chess or an unequal debate, success can come to those with patience and persistence.